Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world that smells faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and whatever that one weird herb was that medieval people insisted cured everything. You're standing in a dimly lit hall, heavy tapestries hanging like sleeping giants on the walls. Outside it's probably raining. Inside you hear a faint jingle. Not coins, not jewelry, but keys. Dozens of them. They hang from a thick iron ring on the belt of the lady of the house, bouncing gently against her wool skirt as she walks the creaky wooden floor. These keys aren't just for show. They open everything. Grain chests, spice cabinets, linens, the locked coffer where she keeps her candle stash. The medieval equivalent of having the remote. Holding the household keys wasn't just convenient. It meant authority, responsibility, and let's be honest, a lot of stress. Because if someone steals the silver spoons, that's on you, key lady. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing the time zones roll in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit down on a low bench beside the hearth. The fire crackles softly. Someone hands you a goblet of something warm and slightly questionable. It's the 1300s, so let's just pretend it's wine. Across the room, the lady of the manor is busy. She's moving slowly, deliberately, checking the locks on every chest and coffer. You can see that ring of keys swinging from her waist like a medieval Swiss Army knife. They're made of iron. Heavy, cold, and shaped with meticulous little notches. Some are ornate, others blunt and purely functional. One has an almost floral head, delicate and sharp. You realize she's not just locking up stuff, she's locking up power. These keys are her badge of control over the domestic world. The servants report to her. The meal schedule follows her orders. She decides who gets what, when, and how much. And the locks she holds are as much about trust as they are about security. But let's rewind slightly. Why are these keys even hers? You'd think, in an era where women couldn't vote and sometimes weren't even allowed to choose their own shoes, they'd hardly be trusted with the family valuables. Well, welcome to one of medieval Europe's odd little loopholes. While public power went to men, lords, knights, guild leaders, the private sphere was often controlled by women. Not because people were super enlightened, but because someone had to manage the absurd logistics of a household that fed 40, employed 10, and could go bankrupt from one wool shipment delay. So women, especially married ones, ran the show at home. And keys were the quiet, jangling proof of that. It's why in countless medieval portraits and illuminated manuscripts, noble women are shown with keys on their belt. Not a sword, not a scroll. A literal ring of access. Here's the fun twist. You know those oversized keyrings? Yeah, they weren't for convenience. They were basically portable stress generators. Each key might unlock something precious, or something problematic. The wrong servant with access to the mead barrels? Say goodbye to winter rations. And heaven help you if you misplace the key to the linen chest before your cousin's wedding. That brings us to our first mainstream historical fact. In noble and merchant households, the lady of the house, or domina if you want to get fancy, was expected to oversee provisioning, staff, inventory, and household accounts. The keys weren't just props. They were actual job tools. Now here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. Some women kept separate lockboxes just for the keys themselves. Like, they locked up the things that unlock other things. Why? Because key theft was a real concern. Not like, oh no, someone took my phone charger. But more like, oops, someone opened the silver chest and pawned our best goblets. In fact, there are records of women sleeping with their key boxes under the pillow. Forget silk nightcaps, this is medieval risk management. But historians still argue whether all this key holding really meant power in the sense we understand it. Was the key holder a mini-queen of her castle? Or just an unpaid, overworked administrator with no vacation days and a rising case of gout? Some scholars think it was empowering. Others say it was just a fancier kind of servitude, dressed in velvet. Meanwhile, you're still watching that lady check her locks. She pauses over the pantry. This one's always risky. Last week, someone pinched 3 cloves and a chunk of lard. She's narrowed it down to 2 kitchen boys and 1 suspiciously smug-looking cat. In truth, the role of keyholder could be isolating. The responsibility came with suspicion. If anything went missing, guess who got blamed first? Yep, the woman with the keys. You had to be meticulous, even paranoid. One chronicler from the 14th century wrote that a careless mistress once lost an entire winter's meat due to a bad lock and worse judgment. Spoiler: they ate pickled turnips for 2 months. But still, there's a strange comfort in the ritual of it. The turning of keys, the methodical checking, the quiet little sigh when each latch clicks closed for the night. It's the sound of order, of calm in a very chaotic world. Your modern brain might still be wondering why the husband didn't just do it, but remember, he was busy doing night things, or writing poetry, or losing money gambling on falcon races. Also, side note, some keys were deliberately oversized. Not because the locks were huge, but to make a statement. "Look how much stuff I control," they screamed, as they knocked against door frames and startled passing dogs. You're basically listening to a medieval version of someone dropping a ring of smart home remotes. You shift slightly, the fire crackling louder now. Maybe you'd make a good key holder. Or maybe not. You once lost your car keys in the fridge. But back then, keeping the household keys was considered part of a wife's essential duties. It was literally part of marriage arrangements, which we'll get to next. For now, just listen to the soft creak of a wooden coffer being locked, the metal glint of controls sliding into leather folds. It's not flashy power. It won't win a jousting tournament. But it keeps the household alive. The smell of hearth smoke fades into something softer. Linen soap, beeswax, maybe a hint of old barley. You're now leaning over a carved oak table, trying not to sneeze on a sheaf of parchment. There's a marriage contract in front of you, sealed with thick red wax and a string of clauses so precise they could make a prenup blush. One line, right between the cow dowry and who gets to decide how many pigs count as reasonable, states something like, "The wife shall maintain the keys and oversight of the household stores." There it is. Right there. The key clause. Literally. Marriage back then wasn't just love and lace, and to be fair, lace hadn't even been invented yet. It was business. Strategic alliance. Merging of estates, alliances, even family grudges. And in that merger, the wife was often the logistics manager. As soon as she entered the home, she was handed the keys. Unless, of course, there was a difficult mother-in-law still lurking in the solar upstairs. Sometimes the transition was smooth. The bride was trained from a young age, learning how to record bread deliveries and budget for winter ale. Other times, not so much. Imagine being 15, married off to a grumpy merchant twice your age, and suddenly expected to know where the saffron is kept and how many candles you're allowed to burn per week. And saffron is not cheap, mind you. That's your mainstream historical fact for this round. Managing household goods and holding the keys was formally written into many marital contracts, especially among the rising merchant class and landed gentry. It wasn't just assumed, it was agreed upon, negotiated, and sometimes even debated by parents before the wedding feast began. But you want quirky? Oh, I've got quirky. Let's talk about chests. Specifically, locked chests. These weren't your typical IKEA footlockers. They were reinforced wood, sometimes banded in iron, often requiring multiple keys, or, in some paranoid households, even 2 people turning keys at once like some sort of medieval missile launch. And women didn't just get one chest. No. They might bring several into the marriage as part of their trousseau. One for linen, one for spices, one for special items, which could mean anything from jewelry to religious relics to that one perfect bolt of imported silk they were waiting to turn into a party dress. And you guessed it, each chest had a different key. By now your hip is starting to ache just imagining that keyring bouncing against your bones all day. But this wasn't just about storage. The key holder needed to protect these chests from moisture, theft, and sometimes husbands. Yep, there are scattered references in court documents to women locking certain items away from their own spouses. Sometimes it was for safekeeping. Sometimes it was revenge. Sometimes, let's be honest, it was because their husband couldn't be trusted with the holiday pie spices. And here's where it gets juicier. Historians still argue whether wives with lockboxes had full control, or were merely enacting duties assigned by their husbands. Were these women early stewards of domestic power? Or glorified managers, expected to break their backs over barley inventories while their husbands dined with clergy and plotted vineyard expansions? The records don't always agree. Some letters and diaries suggest respect and autonomy. Others imply micromanagement and mild resentment. Meanwhile, you're still squinting at that marriage contract. The ink has faded, but you can make out a line about appropriate access to valuables. What does appropriate even mean in medieval Latin? Probably whatever the in-laws said it meant. Down the hall, a new bride has just moved into her husband's family home. It's been a chaotic week of introductions, veiled insults, and one embarrassing incident involving the pickled fish barrel. Today she's given her own keyring. Her fingers tremble slightly as she threads it onto her belt. Her own mother once told her, "The keys aren't just metal, they're trust. Lose them and you lose the house." It's not symbolic. If you couldn't handle your household duties, your reputation took a hit. Rumors might swirl. In some cases, husbands did take the keys away, and that was deeply humiliating. It would be like someone walking into your office, yanking your badge off your neck, and telling you to stick to folding napkins. Brutal. In wealthier homes, some women even had custom-made lockboxes for their keys alone. Small, handheld boxes they could carry from room to room. Think of them as the medieval version of those cute designer mini purses that are just big enough for a lipstick and a warning. One surviving example from a 15th century Italian household is etched with delicate floral patterns and the initials of the matron herself. It locked with a miniature bolt. You lock your locks. That's where we are. Of course, not all keys were treated equally. Some were purely practical, like the key to the cellar where the onions wept in the dark. Others were prestige symbols. The key to the good spice chest where cinnamon, pepper, and nutmeg lived in luxury might only be used on feast days. And you better believe you triple-check it was locked afterward. One stolen clove could cost you half a hen. You pause, picturing that kind of pressure. No passwords, no fingerprint scanners, just metal and memory. Misplace a key and the whole household suffers. Drop it in the pig pen? Good luck getting it back without making unfortunate friends. A servant walks past, carrying a fresh batch of wax tablets and looking utterly exhausted. You notice she doesn't have a keyring. That's by design. Servants were expected to follow instructions, not hold the means to override them. In fact, it was a dismissible offense to tamper with a mistress's keys. There are records of one kitchen maid being publicly shamed for making a wax impression of her lady's pantry key. That's right, medieval forgery, folks. She was basically a black market cake smuggler. So here you are, seated beside a flickering rushlight, watching a young bride test her new keyring. One key sticks in the lock, typical. She jigs it, frowns, and makes a mental note to ask the steward for oil. You can see the weight of it settling on her shoulders, not just the keys themselves, but what they represent. Duty, trust, authority, and the very real possibility of being blamed for missing grain. In that sense, keys were less about locking others out, and more about locking yourself in to a lifetime of monitoring, managing, and maintaining. Romantic, huh? You're up early today, not because you're a morning person, but because in this particular medieval village, dawn means something. The fog's still clinging to the rooftops like a sleepy cat, and the church bell is groaning through its morning toll. You're standing in the muddy path just outside the kitchen door, watching the lady of the house lean slightly as she walks, the weight of her keys tugging at her hip. This morning she's checking the storage rooms. Again. Because last night, someone swore they heard a suspicious clink near the dried plum cabinet. And we're not taking any chances with the dessert stash. Her keys jangle with every step, a metallic whisper that tells the whole household she's coming. It's not unlike the way high school teachers wear loud shoes. You hear the noise, you straighten up. You pretend you weren't trying to pocket a sugared almond. And while you're standing there, shivering just slightly, something else catches your attention: gossip. Not whispered in corners, but tossed casually like a ball between two washerwomen scrubbing linens by the trough. One says, "She added another key to her ring yesterday," and the other raises an eyebrow so high it nearly floats away. A new key means a new lock, which means a new level of privacy or secrecy. You start to notice the pattern. In this world, keys are more than functional. They're signals. A new key? That's juicy. A missing one? Even juicier. One particularly smug chambermaid passes by with goose fat on her sleeves and mischief in her eyes, and you suddenly remember, in medieval England, goose fat was sometimes used as a contraceptive. Yep, applied directly. Not pleasant. Not recommended. But used. And now you're wondering if one of those locked cabinets is storing more than just mead. There's your quirky tidbit of the day. Among the many odd items women kept hidden under lock and key were rudimentary contraceptives. Herbs like pennyroyal, poultices of wool soaked in strange brews, And yes, even that famously greased goose fat. These things weren't discussed openly, of course. They were whispered about behind backs, stored discreetly, and often passed from older women to younger ones under the guise of household remedies. Back to the lady with the keys. As she unlocks the pantry for the cook, you notice that key doesn't jangle. It slides out with almost no sound. Why? Because she's oiled it with lamp grease to keep it silent. That's not just care, that's intention. There are times when you don't want people to know what you're unlocking. Maybe it's a dowry chest. Maybe it's the cupboard where you hide letters. Maybe it's just the cinnamon. But silence in this case is a power move. Which brings us to the performance of key wearing. Think of it like modern fashion accessories, except more passive-aggressive. A jangly, prominent keyring said, "I run this place." A modest, quiet one said, "I'm in charge, but I'm not rude about it." And not wearing your keys at all? That invited all kinds of speculation. So now you're following her through the corridors, past a woven screen and into the still sleeping solar. She checks another chest. This one's fancier. Polished wood, iron studs, a key that looks almost ceremonial. She doesn't just open it. She does it slowly with care, like she's letting in something sacred or maybe dangerous. Inside, letters. Few coins. A tiny bottle with a red wax seal. The air smells faintly of rose oil and dried mint. And here's where things get socially slippery. Not all keys were for things you'd want everyone to know about. Some noblewomen had private drawers with coded locks. Yes, actual coded locks, complete with rotating rings of letters or symbols. Historians still argue whether these were widely used or just a few novelty cases in Italy and France. Either way, the idea was there. Some women wanted to keep their thoughts private, even in a world where nothing stayed secret for long. Meanwhile, you pass a servant polishing the stone floor. She glances at the keyring on her mistress's belt with a mixture of admiration and was that envy? Because here's the thing, keys could unlock food, money, even medicine. A trusted servant might be given temporary access. But permanent key holding? That was reserved. Exclusive. Like a club you couldn't quite join. And yes, the lady of the house might gossip just as much as the washerwomen. Don't let the stern bun fool you. One documented case from the 14th century tells of two rival mistresses, one from a merchant house and the other from a minor noble family, having an escalating Cold War entirely fought through keys. One had her pantry key copied. The other responded by locking the firewood and blaming the chimney boy. It escalated to actual public insults at church, which back then was the medieval version of subtweeting. And through all this, you begin to understand keys weren't just about things. They were about status, control, and yes, sometimes petty social battles. You hear a child crying in the background. Probably one of the scullery maids. The lady of the house pauses. Her face softens. She pulls a small ring from a pouch, removes a tinier key, like one made for a jewelry box, and unlocks a tiny cabinet built into the wall. Inside, dried apple slices, honey ginger, and a stitched rag doll. She hands it to the maid without saying a word. That's the thing. Power and tenderness weren't always opposites here. The same woman who managed inventories like a medieval Excel spreadsheet could also remember a child's comfort item. Let's not romanticize too much, though. There was still tension. If anything went missing, the suspicion fell first on the woman with the keys. Theft among servants was common, but so were accusations made in anger. A misplaced key could cost someone their job, or worse, their place in the community. Because even if it wasn't your fault, maybe the key just slipped through a floorboard, whispers spread fast. And in villages where everyone knew everything, that kind of reputation could follow you for decades. You're now back in the corridor. The door closes softly behind you. The day has begun. Fires lit. Bread baked. Keys jangling like wind chimes of authority. And you? You've just witnessed the kind of domestic diplomacy that makes the United Nations look chill by comparison. Your feet ache from all this imaginary walking, so you plop down on a low stone bench beside the manor's kitchens, hoping for a whiff of something roasted. Instead, the air smells like damp bread and mild panic. Inside the kitchen, flour clouds the air like it's auditioning for a dramatic fog scene. Pots are clanging. A chicken may or may not have escaped. It's controlled chaos, and all of it. Every ladle, grain sack, and spice jar is under lock and key. You're beginning to realize something. In medieval households, food storage was political. No, not caviar and silk level politics. More like, who gets to open the pickled turnips level drama. You didn't just feed the household, you rationed, scheduled, protected, and occasionally had to explain why the mutton disappeared 3 days too early. That brings us to your mainstream historical fact. In the late Middle Ages, food preservation wasn't just about salting or drying, it was about guarding. Women, especially in upper and middle-class homes, held keys to pantries, buttery rooms, spice cabinets, and sometimes entire granaries. These spaces were often locked not just from the outside world, but from within the household. That included servants, relatives, and yes, sometimes even husbands, not out of malice but out of sheer necessity. If one person snuck extra raisins from the pie cupboard, the whole week's dessert plan crumbled. You peek inside the pantry. Dark. Cool. Smelling of old wood, onions, and powdered ginger. There's a ledger on a narrow shelf where today's rations are recorded in tiny, scratchy writing. You wonder how many times someone accidentally forgot to write down an extra pinch of pepper. And remember, back then, pepper was essentially a luxury item. A few stolen grams could mean days of suspicion and side-eye glances over supper. Now let's get to the fun part. The locked pantry war. No, it's not an actual battle with tiny swords and butter knives. It's the term we're borrowing for a very real, very passive-aggressive power struggle that simmered behind closed cupboard doors. Picture this. The lady of the house has 3 pantry keys. One she wears. One is hidden. One is given temporarily to the head cook, but only during feast days, and only after a lecture longer than most sermons. Then one day the honey goes missing. Just gone. The servants are summoned. The cook insists she locked up after using it. The chambermaid says she saw the door ajar. The stable boy mysteriously has a sticky face. Cue drama. You wouldn't think a tablespoon of honey could cause this much strife. But in a world where sugar was a special occasion luxury, this was serious business. Accusations fly. Trust fractures. In one famous case from 15th century Burgundy, a noblewoman accused her cook of pantry theft and had her locked in the actual pantry for a day as punishment. Irony. Achieved. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some particularly paranoid ladies of the house created fake keys. Decoys. They'd wear them visibly on their belt, while the real key was hidden in a pocket, a shoe, or even sewn into the hem of a gown. Yes, this actually happened, because nothing says "don't touch my prunes" like psychological warfare. It wasn't just about food, of course. Controlling access to food meant controlling health, morale, and even the pace of the household. Servants depended on their rations. Schedules for baking, brewing, and meat smoking were all tied to the mistress's permission. Bread wasn't baked just when someone felt peckish. It followed a rhythm, a calendar, and a locked cabinet full of flour. Oh, and remember, some of these kitchens had upwards of 10 staff members. That's 10 people with varying levels of hunger, honesty, and curiosity walking past your precious sack of nutmeg every day. Locking it away wasn't cruel. It was survival. Historians still argue whether this tight food control gave women real power or just a difficult job. Some view it as an extension of patriarchal responsibility, delegated with no real respect. Others suggest that women who mastered the management of food stores gained considerable influence within their households and beyond. Think of it as strategic logistics wrapped in an apron. You glance toward the buttery. No, not butter. The buttery was the room for barrels of ale, wine, and sometimes even vinegars. The term comes from butt, as in large casks. Go ahead, giggle. That room too was locked, and only 1 or 2 people in the house held that key. An unlocked buttery was an invitation to scandal. People didn't just sneak in for a sip. They'd dilute, mislabel, or in rare but spicy cases poison the contents. Yeah, about that, let's just say that sometimes the lady of the house locked up the pantry not just to keep food safe but to keep herself safe. Food tampering was a genuine fear in certain noble circles. And in-laws could be enthusiastic. There's a recorded incident in 1372 where an inheritance dispute ended with someone putting crushed glass into a honey jar. Which I mean rude. Now your eye catches the spice chest. This one's ornate. Carved lid. Brass hinges. 3 different locks. This isn't for the garlic. This is for the good stuff. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from Zanzibar, cardamom, dried oranges. These weren't just flavorings, they were currency, diplomatic gifts, dowry bonuses. And if a chest like that went missing, that wasn't just household drama. That was grounds for legal action. The lady unlocks it with a key so worn it's nearly smooth. She counts the cinnamon sticks, makes a note, locks it again. And you, watching from the shadows, realize you just witnessed a ritual as sacred as lighting a temple lamp. In this world, storage wasn't static, it was a chessboard. Every lock a boundary, every key a move. And the pantry? That was the queen's corner. As you walk back down the corridor, you hear faint singing from the kitchen. The morning drama's faded. Bread's rising. Pots are simmering. But the keys? Still swinging. Still watching. And somewhere, probably right now, someone's trying to sneak an extra fig. You've seen the household keys carry status, stress, and the occasional smuggled gooseberry tart. But now the air feels heavier. Less like baked bread. More like cold stone and things left unsaid. You're deeper inside the manor. Past the buttery and the pantry wars. This is where the stakes rise. Where holding the keys could cost you more than a missed meal. Could cost you your life. You find yourself in a smaller, darker chamber. The windows are narrow slits. The floor's been swept clean, but you can still see scratch marks on the wooden door. As if someone once tried very hard to get out, or to keep someone else in. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the night. In certain noble households, the keys weren't just to pantries and linen closets. They were also to strongboxes, dowry chests, and rooms containing confidential documents or lethal substances. And when things went wrong, politically, financially, or romantically, guess who held the evidence? That's right. The lady with the keys. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. Women being accused of theft, sabotage, or even treason because they had access. A missing document, a misplaced seal, a suspicious bottle, blame the keyholder. She had motive, right? Or at least opportunity. After all, she had the lock. And not all these accusations were false. Let's rewind to 15th century Florence. A merchant's wife is found unconscious beside her husband's ledger. She had the only key to the room where it was kept. When he recovered, he claimed she'd tried to destroy evidence of her own lavish spending. Others whispered she had found proof of his debt, and he'd made sure she couldn't tell anyone. No charges were filed, but the key was quietly taken from her belt. In noble families where inheritance and power played a deadly game, the stakes could be even worse. Take the infamous case of Lady Maud of Herefordshire. She oversaw a large estate, keys jangling like a coral bell every time she moved. She managed every coffer, every stockpile, every private chamber. Then one day she disappeared. Vanished like a ghost in a fog bank. Her keys were found buried beneath a hearthstone, alongside a torn bit of her gown and a pair of gold buttons known to belong to her husband's mistress. Quirky tidbit? Her ghost, according to local legend, still wanders the manor kitchen muttering about the key to the third drawer. But not every story ends with tragedy. Some women use their key-wielding roles strategically. In Spain, there's a record of a noblewoman locking her husband out of his own solar during a financial dispute. When questioned, she claimed, "My lord is best served by silence and sturdy oak." Subtle. Dramatic. Possibly followed by sleeping in separate towers. Still, historians debate how much real power these women had. Were they using the keys to defend their positions? Or were the keys simply symbols, easily revoked by a suspicious husband or a jealous rival? The evidence varies. In some court records, we see women testifying with incredible precision about household inventories. In others, they're reduced to footnotes, mentioned only as former holders of keys. And sometimes the stakes turn political. You move now through a cool, echoing hallway. Stone underfoot, tapestries whispering with every breath of air. You pass a locked study. Inside is a chest holding something more dangerous than silver. Letters. Correspondence between noble houses. Arranged marriages. Promises. Threats. The key to this room is carried not by a knight, but by his wife. She can't read all of it. Few women of her rank are fully literate, but she knows what matters. Seals. Names. The shape of power, even if not its precise language. In one such household, the lady of the manor held the key to a locked desk that contained a letter implicating her husband in a plot against the king. Did she turn him in? Did she destroy it? We'll never know. The desk was burned the next week. The key? Found in a well months later. It's moments like this that make you realize the keys weren't just about kitchens. They were access, insight, leverage. Back in the manor, you find yourself in the herbal room. It's tucked behind the solar, quiet and warm with the scent of lavender and dried rosemary. A small chest rests on a shelf, locked. You already know what's in it. Recipes for tinctures. Maybe a love charm. Maybe a sleeping draught that works a little too well. These weren't necessarily poisons, but they weren't exactly harmless. And in the wrong hands or the right ones, such concoctions could change a fate or two. Here's a spicy fringe tidbit for the curious listener. In the late 14th century, a woman in northern France was accused of lacing her husband's wine with quieting herbs to keep him docile. When confronted, she calmly unlocked a cedar chest, showed the herbs, and claimed they were for headaches. Historians still argue whether she was an early chemist, a cunning wife, or just really tired of being interrupted during dinner. You lean against the wall and feel the cold seeping through. Somewhere above, you hear the clink of keys again. It's different now. Not just domestic. Not just practical. The sound feels sharper, heavier. Like the jangling of potential, of secrets locked away, and others barely hidden. And perhaps the greatest weight a keyholder carried was the fear of losing the keys. Not just physically, though that was a genuine nightmare, but symbolically. If your husband stripped you of your keyring, it was a sign. You were no longer trusted. In some households it meant demotion. In others, divorce. In the worst cases it preceded exile or death. You pass another doorway. Locked. You don't know what's behind it. Neither do most of the servants. Only the lady and the steward have access. One theory. It's where the debt books are kept. Another. Letters from a previous suitor. Another still. Nothing. Just an empty space locked out of habit. The key too sacred to lose, too scary to use. The hallway fades now. You're not sure if it's dusk or just your eyes adjusting to the dark. But you understand something new. Holding the keys wasn't just about running a household. Sometimes it meant holding a loaded question. And hoping no one asked it. You're not sure how long you've been walking these stone corridors now. Hours? Days? Maybe centuries. Time has that soft blur around the edges here. The kind that makes you forget whether it's morning or twilight or just the candles playing tricks again. Either way, the hallway you're in now feels different. There's something reverent in the air. Like you've stumbled into a place where people whisper even when no one's listening. And that's fitting because tonight's keys aren't just practical. They're spiritual. Symbolic. Strange. You pass a small wooden door carved with the image of a saint, Saint Zita, patron of household workers. The room behind it smells faintly of frankincense and beeswax. There's an altar tucked into the corner and just beneath it, a locked chest. This isn't for money, grain, or even documents. It's for relics. Which brings us to your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval households, especially noble and religious ones, women held keys to private chapels and devotional relics. These weren't ceremonial. They were sacred. One 14th century inventory from a German estate lists the reliquary of Saint Martha, kept beneath 3 locks, of which the lady alone holds the keys. That's not delegation. That's divine trust. Inside these reliquary chests, bones, bits of cloth, a splinter of wood allegedly from the true cross, sometimes even teeth, holy teeth, because nothing says spiritual security like a locked molar. You walk through the quiet chapel, your steps muffled by rushes on the floor. You pause by a cabinet, iron-bound, heavy, and suspiciously well guarded. This, according to your whispered tour guide, who's also possibly a ghost, is the chest holding the household's sacred oils, used for blessings, healings, and sometimes a little creative spiritual encouragement. If you catch my drift. And then there's the legend of Saint Genevieve's key. In medieval Paris, women prayed to her not just for chastity or fertility, but for protection over household keys. Yes, she was believed to keep them from being lost or misused. According to local stories, a woman who left her keys unlocked overnight would suffer 3 days of bad bread and unwelcome guests. Harsh but motivating. Your quirky tidbit tonight? In some superstitious corners of Europe, people believed keys could become cursed. If a key was involved in a theft, a betrayal, or a broken promise, it might carry the spiritual weight of that sin. People would bury cursed keys in churchyards or toss them into rivers to prevent misfortune from clinging to the home. So now you're standing near the manor's well, peering down into its dark throat, and wondering just how many bad luck keys are sleeping beneath the surface. Spoiler: probably more than a few. A key tossed in a well was a powerful gesture. It meant a final severing of access of control. No more, it said as the ripples swallowed the past. But not all spiritual uses of keys were this dramatic. In some religious orders, nuns held keys to cloisters and treasure rooms, literal treasure rooms by the way, filled with gifts, tithes, and sometimes royal bribes. Abbesses in particular were known to keep private key boxes, which they guarded with the intensity of a tax auditor and the grace of a librarian. A Benedictine abbess in 1421 reportedly slept with her keys around her neck to avoid any monastic mischief. Historians still argue whether these religious keyholders were true power players or just well-behaved stewards in wimples. Some say they commanded real influence within their communities. Others think their control was only as strong as the bishop's willingness to look the other way. Now you're in a different part of the manor. Less stone, more warmth. Wood-paneled walls. The light is golden, flickering. A little strange. You're in a birth chamber. Or at least what was a birth chamber. There's a locked cabinet here too. It holds linen cloths, small bottles of wine, dried herbs, and prayers stitched into fabric. The midwife has her own key. So does the lady of the house. The contents are precious, and also a little terrifying. One of those jars. It holds a piece of ribbon soaked in saintly water. Another, crushed fennel and myrrh. And in the smallest box, tied with string and slightly singed at one edge, a charm. Medieval childbirth wasn't exactly easy. Women often prepared for it like a military campaign. Except instead of armor, they brought rosemary and cross-stitches of Jesu mercy. Locked birth chests weren't about secrecy, they were about safety. Emotional, physical, and spiritual. And sometimes the keys to these chests were passed down like heirlooms. Not just objects but stories. Hopes. Quiet, trembling courage. You move slowly now, past the chamber and into a little alcove filled with books. Well, books is generous. Manuscripts. Recipe scrolls. A few oddly thick volumes of psalms and weather predictions. One small chest sits near the fire, locked as always. Inside, likely a mix of herbal recipes and coded personal thoughts. And here comes our fringe tidbit for this round. Some medieval women, especially literate noblewomen, kept personal journals in chests locked with unique handmade keys. A few surviving examples show a pattern of coded writing, simple ciphers, often mixed with Latin, sometimes poetic in nature. These weren't just diaries. They were spiritual negotiations, bargains with God, confessions, sometimes curses. Imagine locking away your fears, literally. Your thoughts bound in wax paper and buried beneath a key no one else can turn. The sound of the click? That's your secret saying goodnight. The air in this part of the manor is quieter now. Candles are burning low. Somewhere in the walls, mice are daring each other to raid the barley bin. And overhead, the keys are still swaying. Gentle metal sighs in the pockets and pouches of women whose names we barely remember. But they were here. They locked the cupboards and unlocked the prayers. They protected the bread, the children, the family secrets, and the things no one could name without trembling. They turned their keys softly in the middle of the night, not to wake anyone, but also not to let anything dangerous in. Not all keys were forged in iron. Some were forged in faith, in fear, and in the quiet resistance of women who knew exactly what their silence was worth. You're back near the manor's great hall now. The fire's been reduced to glowing embers, and the mood has shifted. This isn't the calm warmth of kitchens and chapels anymore. No, now you're brushing shoulders with tension. The kind that simmers just beneath stitched smiles and polite curtsies. Because tonight we're meeting the women who didn't get the keys. The ones left watching from the sidelines, fingers twitching, stomachs tight, wondering what they did, or didn't do to be left out. You're seated on a narrow wooden bench beside the hearth. Across from you, a woman stitches a bit of wool with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgery. Her name is Lady Cecily, and she's the second wife of a local lord. She has a respectable gown, a tidy braid, and absolutely no keys on her belt. And she's furious about it. Which brings us to tonight's mainstream historical fact. Not every wife held the keys. In many cases, stepmothers, second wives, widows living with in-laws, or women married into already established households found themselves excluded from the domestic power structure. Especially in wealthy homes where the mother-in-law still ruled from the solar like a velvet-draped monarch. There's Lady Cecily, nodding politely as the cook asks permission to serve early supper, then immediately turning red when the cook realizes her mistake and rushes upstairs to ask the real keyholder. Lady Margaret, her mother-in-law. It's not uncommon. Control over the household keys could be retained by a matriarch well into old age. And giving them up? That wasn't just making space for the next generation. It was stepping off the throne. Some women delayed that moment as long as possible. A few never handed the keys over at all, dying with them still clutched in stiff fingers. So second wives like Lady Cecily? They had to sit back, smile, pretend they didn't mind that the preserves cupboard was locked every evening without their input. And here's the quirky tidbit. One recorded incident from a Flemish merchant household in 1439 describes a key-related Cold War between a second wife and her husband's aging sister. The sister, technically unmarried and technically temporary, refused to give up the keys. So the wife retaliated by locking her out of the laundry room. By winter, the family was down 1 tub, 3 servants, and all semblance of harmony. Gets worse. In some cases, the woman with the keys wasn't even a family member. Wealthy widowers would sometimes leave keyholding to a trusted female steward or housekeeper. These women weren't technically nobility, but they were terrifyingly efficient. And if you were the new bride, trying to ease into your household role only to find the linen keys hanging from the hip of a stone-faced, salt-haired woman named Agatha? Good luck. Historians still argue whether this exclusion was a calculated power grab or just pragmatic household management. Was the mother-in-law protecting family order? Or just clinging to control like a dragon on a gold pile? Documents vary. Letters from some younger wives show genuine admiration. Others not so much. One particularly blunt account from a 14th-century diary reads, "She will not give me the key to the candles. I write by moonlight and dream of beeswax revenge. Now you're walking through a quieter part of the manor. The air is stale. This wing hasn't seen much use lately." A window creaks open, and behind a half-closed door, you glimpse a woman in widow's weeds folding linens, her shoulders curved with age or maybe defeat. Meet Widow Alina. She lived here once with her husband, who owned every timber and stone in the place. When he died, she stayed on. But the new heir is married now, and the new wife has claimed the keys. So Widow Alina lives in the guest room, sleeps under blankets she didn't fold, and asks permission to use her own spice chest. It's not uncommon. In medieval law, widows were often entitled to dower rights, a portion of their husband's estate, including the right to live in the home. But power? That was harder to keep. A new generation brings new alliances. And the keys, those literal tools of control, pass swiftly, sometimes coldly, from one set of hands to another. Which is why some women fought back. Quietly, of course. This was a subtle battlefield. One might start locking her own door at night. Another might accidentally misplace the only key to the honey chest right before a feast. And a few particularly bold types? They made copies. Yes, even back then. Skilled metalworkers could replicate keys if you paid well and asked no questions. In one household account, the appearance of 2 matching spice keys led to a week-long investigation and the abrupt reassignment of 2 kitchen staff. So yes, key envy was real. It wasn't just practical frustration. It was emotional, symbolic. In a world where women were already so often locked out of public power, to be locked out within your own home was the final insult. You pass a row of benches where younger women are weaving. No keys hang from their belts either. Daughters, cousins, poor relations, they're all future maybes. Potential keyholders if they marry well or if the stars align. Until then they wait. They sew. And sometimes they stew. And that's where the danger lies. Because while the keyholder walks the halls with pride and weight and jangling confidence, there are always others watching. Not with knives but with notebooks. Learning. Observing. Waiting for their moment. The manor isn't quiet anymore. You hear footsteps from above. Someone has opened the main coffer. Creaks. A latch snaps. And somewhere, a second wife is knitting faster than necessary. She knows what she's waiting for. because sooner or later someone loses a key, and someone else is already ready to take their place. It's early evening now, and the shadows stretch long across the cobblestones. You step outside the manor for a breath of fresh, manure-tinged air and end up on a narrow street of a bustling medieval town. The energy here is different, faster, louder, more chaotic than the quiet calculations of the manor walls. And surprisingly, the keys follow you. You're staring at an enormous iron ring, nearly the size of a dinner plate, hanging from the hip of a stern-faced city official. It gleams dully in the fading light, and as he walks past you realize, these aren't pantry keys. These are city gate keys. The kind that lock and unlock access to everything. And just like that, you've zoomed out. We're leaving the linen cupboards and locked herb drawers behind, at least for a moment, and looking at how keys shape public spaces, and how occasionally, just occasionally, a woman got to hold them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval towns and cities, keys to fortifications, storehouses, and treasuries were symbols of state power. Mayors, magistrates, and guild leaders, almost always men, carried these keys as literal badges of office. The bigger the key, the bigger the authority. It was less locksmith chic, and more medieval flex. But in rare and deliciously odd moments, women were trusted with these oversized metaphors. Let's rewind to 1376, York. A wealthy widow named Marjorie took on the role of keeper of the city's guest house. She was entrusted with the keys not just to the linens classic, but to the building itself, gates, strongboxes, even the lock to the ledger room. This wasn't a glorified maid gig. It was administrative, trusted, and people noticed. That's where the line starts to blur. Were the household keys a gateway to broader civic involvement? Or were exceptions like Marjorie just flukes, quirky one-offs in a system that still kept women in the shadows? Historians still argue about this. Some say women with wealth and widowed status could sidestep societal limits, using domestic responsibility as a springboard to local influence. Others insist it was more about pragmatism than progress. Marjorie got the keys because her son had gone to war, not because the city suddenly embraced feminism. Either way, it's intriguing. You walk now into the town square. At its center, a large ceremonial key. It's not for actual use. It's symbolic, handed out to important guests like bishops or royal messengers. The keys to the city, they say with great fanfare. Sound familiar? Yep, that phrase still lingers today. And it harks back to these literal weighty objects once presented during festivals, coronations, or military parades. And while women were almost never the recipients of such keys, they were the ones making sure the celebratory banquets happened afterward. Every feast, every town event, every delicately salted almond was made possible by women coordinating behind the scenes. Keys jingling somewhere in the background. Here comes your quirky tidbit. In Bruges, during a 15th century festival, an official accidentally handed the ceremonial city key to a baker's wife instead of the foreign dignitary. She took it, thanked him politely, and reportedly said, "I already run half the city. This just makes it official." Legend claims she kept it for a full day and had a copy made. Was it true? Unlikely. Is it the kind of historical gossip we live for? Absolutely. You meander now past a guild hall. The door is heavy oak, bolted from the inside. Only a few people carry the master keys, and they're all male. Or so you assume, until a young woman with ink-stained fingers slips through a side entrance. She's the daughter of a scribe, trained in bookkeeping, and technically not allowed in guild affairs. But her father trusts her. So she copies records, keeps ledgers. And when he's sick, she's the one they whisper about sending the documents to. No key on her belt. But she knows where they're kept. And knowledge is, let's be honest, its own kind of access. This is where things get really interesting. Some cities did rely on female oversight for parts of civic life, particularly in markets and health inspections. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, women known as Weinschreiberinnen, wine writers, helped oversee wine taxation. Did they carry keys to wine cellars? Occasionally, yes. Did that make them powerful? Kind of. And if you think that's fun, meet the alewives. Women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, often controlling access to private storage, barrels, and ledgers. These women held keys, sometimes literally to their cellar doors, sometimes metaphorically to the neighborhood's thirst. And they weren't shy about guarding it. One record from Oxford in 1422 describes an alewife being fined for locking the public ale barrel before the evening bell. Translation: she refused to serve drink after curfew and got in trouble for being too responsible. Classic. Back in your little town, the church bells toll again. You glance toward the watchtower. Another key hangs there. This one for the gate that closes at sundown. Everyone knows it's the bailiff's job to turn it. But one chilly January in 1411, the bailiff's wife did it for him. He had the plague. She didn't. So she locked the city herself and kept the records until his replacement arrived. She wasn't thanked. She was remembered. Historians debate whether that act gave her any real recognition, or if it was quietly filed under unusual events. But her name, Marjorie Cook, shows up again 2 years later, next to an increase in her household's tax status. Make of that what you will. Now you're back in motion, the town winding down, lanterns flickering like sleepy fireflies. A merchant woman closes her stall, locks her box of wares, and slides the key into her sleeve. Her daughter watches, learns. Because even if the city keys were rarely made for women's hands, the practice of locking, managing, safeguarding, that was something they understood intimately. Public keys belonged to the city. Private keys shaped the home. But somewhere in the middle, in narrow alleys and backdoor dealings, women were already holding both. You wake with a start, well, not really wake, but drift slightly upward in consciousness. Something's shifted. The jangle of iron, once constant and proud, now sounds more like a memory than a presence. The manor is quiet. Too quiet. It's not just the fire gone low or the servants vanished into sleep. It's the realization that you haven't heard any keys in a while. They're disappearing. Or maybe they never quite existed the way you thought. Because tonight you start peeling back the layers. Fiction versus fact. Custom versus assumption. And honestly, it's messier than a medieval jam recipe. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact that's also a little uncomfortable. Much of what we think we know about medieval women and keys is based on extrapolation, paintings, poems, scattered legal documents, wills. But hard, consistent data? Sparse. One illuminated manuscript might show a noblewoman with a keyring. Another, from the same century, might not mention her household role at all. And yet a third will describe her guarding the chest, while also implying she spent most of her time embroidering the family crest into curtains. So who really had the keys? Some definitely did. Wills from the 13th and 14th centuries reference keys pass from mothers to daughters. Inventories list iron ring with keys to the pantries. One will from Lincolnshire in 1383 includes a line that reads, "And to my daughter Alice, the small casket with the 3 keys and all within." What was within? No idea. Spices? Secrets? The world's first medieval to-do list? Historians are still guessing. But other women, especially those outside the noble and merchant classes, might never have touched a key in their lives. In peasant households, locks were rare. Chests had latches. Doors had simple bars. The idea of a woman walking around with 10 jangling keys just wouldn't apply. And yet, in the romantic imagination of later centuries, the lady of the house became synonymous with the keys. Here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. In 18th and 19th century novels set in medieval times, writers often added keyrings to their noble heroines, even when the historical period they referenced didn't feature women holding them that way. Why? Because keys became shorthand for dignity, control, and quiet domestic power. We weren't just seeing history, we were seeing nostalgia. And the worst part? Those little fictional flourishes shaped what we think we know today. You pause beside a shelf stacked with books, some modern, some crumbly. One's open to a page showing a 15th century portrait of a woman with keys on her belt. The caption says, "A lady's authority, rendered in iron." Sounds lovely, until you flip to the historian's footnote in red. The keys may be symbolic. This painting was commissioned after her death. Oops. Even when we do find clear records, say, a household ledger written by a steward, it's often ambiguous. A note might read, "Lady Margaret granted the cook access to the larder." But did she physically hold the key? Or simply approve its use? Did she delegate the actual unlocking to a servant? Was the key metaphorical? Historians still argue about this. Some, like the domestic historians of the 20th century, emphasized women's authority, suggesting that key holding was widespread and deeply respected. Others, particularly more recent feminist scholars, point out that the power of keys often came with no real autonomy. A woman might oversee the cheese cupboard and still be considered legally incompetent to handle property contracts. And then there's the sticky middle, the women who technically held power, but only when men allowed it. Widows, for instance, often gained control over keys and household decisions, but only because there was no male head of house at the time. Their power was real, yes, but also fragile. Remarry and poof, goodbye keys. Welcome back to politely asking your new husband if you can open the spice box. But let's not get too cynical. Because sometimes the household key holder wasn't symbolic or ceremonial. She was a logistical genius. Her name shows up repeatedly in account books. She managed 10 staff, balanced grain reserves across seasons, ordered honey in advance of feast days and had it delivered through an aunt's cousin's friend who traded with monks. Real power, even if it didn't come with a crown. And sometimes that power was contested in the best possible way, with passive-aggressive poetry. Yes, this is real. There's a surviving satirical verse from 14th century London where a disgruntled husband complains about his wife, locking away the best cheese and unlocking only gossip. It's cheeky, pointed, and somehow still relatable. You half expect to find a medieval version of a meme hidden in the margins. This brings us to the blurry space between fact and fanfiction. Because what survives isn't just court records and wills. It's stories. And stories, whether scrawled by monks or embroidered into tapestries, bend the truth like a willow in wind. There's the tale of the noblewoman who hid a will behind a locked panel in the pantry. The key was passed through 3 generations and only recovered during renovations in the 1700s. Do we believe it? Maybe. It sounds a little like a Jane Austen plot on a bender. Then there's the local legend of a cookmaid who swapped her mistress's pantry key with a fake, and ran a secret side hustle selling extra meat to neighbors. A martyr for dessert-based entrepreneurship. There's no proof. But there is a short play written in the 1500s loosely based on her misdeeds. So she lives on in questionable dialogue and slapstick. You're walking again now through a corridor where everything feels slightly off. Not quite real. This is the zone of half history. The place where keys were maybe held. Maybe hidden. Maybe imagined altogether. And it's important to sit with that. Because part of the reason we latch onto the image of the medieval key-holding woman is that it's compelling. It's orderly. Feels satisfying. The idea that women had a quiet domain where they ruled, even if the world outside ignored them. That within the locked cupboards and quietly managed inventories, there was a space for control. But sometimes it's just a story we tell because the real one is harder. Messier. More unequal. You stop before a portrait now, framed in dust and centuries. A woman stands, hands clasped. No key in sight. But behind her, almost hidden in shadow, there's a box. It's locked. No label. No explanation. Did she have the key? Or did someone else? You'll never know. It's late now. The manor has gone still, and the air hangs heavy with a kind of timeless quiet. The fire's out. The footsteps have faded. All around you the rooms are sealed up, every chest latched, every cupboard closed. If there was ever a time to listen for the faint echo of a key turning in a lock, it's now. And yet you don't hear it. Not because the keys are missing, but because they're no longer needed. Welcome to the slow fade of the keyholder. Tonight you followed the jangle of authority, the metal whisper of control, from dusty spice cabinets to city gates. But now you're watching as that sound dims, softens, and eventually vanishes into the fabric of modernity. You've reached the end of the line, the quiet disappearance of the role that once held together the entire household. Here's your mainstream historical fact to start. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the key-holding wife or mistress of the house was no longer central to managing household logistics, at least not in the same lock and key sort of way. As locks improved, privacy expanded, and domestic help professionalized, keys were distributed differently. Sometimes to stewards, sometimes to butlers, sometimes to no one at all. The symbolic ring of keys that once signaled female authority? It was now just keys. You're sitting in a drawing room that looks oddly modern. There's a tea set, a glass-fronted cabinet, maybe even a grandfather clock muttering in the corner. A portrait hangs above the mantel of a woman in fine lace, hands folded politely. There's no keyring on her belt, Not because she doesn't run the house, she probably does, but because her management looks different now. Ledger books, written orders, letters to suppliers. Control has shifted from tangible to written. From locked cupboards to spreadsheets. Okay, not yet spreadsheets, but you see where this is going. Still, it's not just about locks. It's about a cultural shift. The Industrial Revolution begins humming quietly in the distance. Urban living becomes the norm. Apartments replace manor houses. Grocery stores replace salted meat barrels. The average household no longer needs 6 different locks for grain, cheese, and linen. And with those changes, the need for a central domestic keymaster begins to slip away. Here's your quirky final tidbit. In one English household journal from the early 1800s, a woman describes how she retired her ring of keys upon moving to London, storing them in a velvet-lined box as a memento. She writes, "They had been my companion for 24 years. I no longer needed them. The pantry has a bell now." Imagine that. Retiring your keys like you'd retire a sword after a war. That velvet-lined box? It's in a museum now. You can find it tucked in a display on Domestic Life, wedged between a chamber pot and an overly polite dinner bell. But even as the keys disappear from women's belts, they don't disappear from their lives. They just relocate. In a way, the keys don't vanish. They fragment. They miniaturize. A key to a diary, a jewelry box, a drawer, a sewing kit, and then eventually the key to a car, a front door, a safe, a laptop password. The role of the domestic keyholder shrinks and morphs, becoming subtler, less visible, but it's still there. Still practiced in the quiet gestures of people who manage spaces, who keep things running, stocked, safe. They don't need jangling reminders anymore. They know exactly what they're responsible for. Historians still argue over when exactly the cultural image of the key-holding woman disappeared. Some say it faded naturally with modernization. Others argue it was written out, erased by narratives that preferred women as ornaments rather than operators. And yet, when you see old films or costume dramas, the trope persists. The stern housekeeper, the matron with the keyring, the dowager locking away the family silver. It lingers like a ghost, not of a person but of a role. A quiet authority. You walk through one last corridor now, knowing there's nothing left to unlock. The doors are already open or they no longer have locks at all. But as you pass a final cabinet, you notice something small and dull lying beside a folded linen napkin. It's a key. Simple. Unlabeled. Ordinary. And you realize that all this time you've been following echoes, not just of people but of responsibility. The kind that's easy to overlook because it doesn't shout. It manages. It anticipates. It locks things away not to hoard them but to preserve them, and sometimes to protect others. The great households no longer need a key mistress, but the memory of her lingers every time someone says, "Where's the spare key?" Or "Who's in charge here?" Or, "I don't know how she keeps it all together." The answer, of course, is simple. She had the keys. So now it's time to set your own keys down. Let your shoulders fall back into the pillow, the tension melt from your jaw, and your breathing settle into something soft and slow. You've wandered through dim stone corridors, felt the chill of iron against wool, and listened to the stories of women who ran entire worlds from behind quiet, locked doors. Not every name survived. Not every key made it into a museum. But every turn of a lock was part of a life, routine, powerful, flawed, human. Let the images fade now. A hearth glowing low in the corner of a kitchen. A young woman whispering to herself as she tucks a brass key under her mattress. An old widow in a too large house, folding linen she can no longer command. These aren't stories with climaxes. They're stories of rhythms, of daily choices, small gestures, quiet labor. And they've been passed down whether we realize it or not. Your eyelids are heavier now. The fire's down to ashes. The last locked chest has been gently sealed, not because something dangerous is inside, but because not everything needs to be seen all the time. The keys are quiet. The house is safe. And you finally can rest.